Everyone's watching Minneapolis right now. The footage, the chaos, the protests dominating every screen and headline. And while America is completely fixated on that drama, one of the most significant geopolitical shifts in modern history is happening behind closed doors in Ottawa, Washington, and Beijing. The working class and middle class in both the United States and Canada are about to get crushed, and most people have absolutely no idea it's coming. The threat we're talking about is a potential 100% tariff on all goods coming from Canada. Not 25%, 100%. And the consequences of this aren't just economic, they're existential. This entire situation exploded in Davos when Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, delivered what historians might eventually call one of the most important speeches of this century. He didn't just question American leadership. He didn't gently suggest reforms to the global system. He explicitly called for the end of the rules-based order as we know it. He challenged, no, he declared the end of the American empire. That speech would never have happened if we didn't have the specific president in office that we currently do. This is a president who's been throwing America's economic weight around like a wrecking ball, operating with the mentality of a kamikaze pilot, but without any of the honor traditionally attached to that kind of sacrifice. Every move this administration makes feels like mutually assured destruction. The difference is, they're demanding mutual destruction while somehow believing America can survive it better than everyone else. That assumption is about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. So let's talk about what actually happens if Trump follows through on these 100% tariffs against Canada in response to China, potentially routing electric vehicles through Canadian manufacturing. What are the real effects? Not the political theatre. The actual material consequences for ordinary people. The economies of Canada and the United States are not just connected. They are fundamentally intertwined at a molecular level. 75% of Canadian exports flow into the United States. 25% of Canada's entire GDP comes directly from trade with America. But here's what most Americans don't understand. Our manufacturing industry doesn't just benefit from Canadian trade, it requires it. A single car isn't finished before its component parts cross the US-Canada border approximately 7 times. 7 times. The supply chain isn't international, it's binational. It's a single integrated system split by an imaginary line. A 100% tariff doesn't slow that system down, it shuts it down completely. We're talking about immediate massive layoffs across the industrial heartland. For every single job on an automotive assembly line, 7 additional jobs exist in the surrounding economic ecosystem. That's why when manufacturing plants shut down in Ohio and Michigan, entire small towns collapse. These aren't just factories. They're the economic foundation of communities that have existed for generations. Now, you could argue, and many people do, that the monopolistic control of 3 massive corporations over the American auto industry has caused tremendous damage on its own. The average base model pickup truck in the United States right now costs approximately $80,000. $80,000 for an entry-level work vehicle. That's economically insane. So if China were to use Canada as essentially a manufacturing and assembly point, bringing parts into Canada, assembling vehicles there, slapping on a Made in Canada sticker, they could completely bypass the tariffs we've imposed on Chinese goods because of our free trade agreement with Canada. The American market would suddenly be flooded with Chinese-designed trucks and cars, selling for 1/3 the price of comparable American vehicles. Hold on, because I know what you're thinking. That sounds amazing, right? Isn't that exactly what working and middle-class people need? Affordable transportation again instead of being gouged by corporate monopolies charging luxury prices for basic trucks. And yes, from a pure consumer standpoint, you're absolutely right. The average car payment in America is creeping toward $1,000 per month. That's unsustainable. That's predatory. But here's the other side of that equation. Massive immediate job loss. Manufacturing facilities shutting down permanently. Small businesses across industrial towns going bankrupt because the factory workers who kept them alive no longer have paychecks to spend locally. Now you could make the argument that people can always find jobs somehow, somewhere. I know that sounds incredibly shallow and dismissive of real human suffering, but let's put that economic disruption aside for a moment because there's something far more dangerous lurking in these tariff threats. The complete decimation of America's agricultural system. Most Americans have absolutely no idea about this vulnerability. 80 to 90% of the fertilizer used in American agriculture comes from Canada, specifically potash. Canada is the largest producer of potash in the entire world. The United States is the largest importer. The reason American agriculture is sustainable at current production levels, the reason food prices aren't already catastrophically higher than they are, is because we have immediate access to Canadian potash without needing to ship it across oceans. If these 100% tariffs get implemented, it would effectively double the input costs going into agriculture overnight. And we have historical examples of exactly what happens when a nation suddenly loses access to fertilizer. Look at Cuba after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Cuba relied heavily on Soviet fertilizer for its agricultural system. When that supply disappeared, the average Cuban citizen lost between 12 and 20 pounds. They call it the Green Famine. Mass starvation on a scale that most Americans and Canadians simply cannot comprehend because we've never experienced anything remotely similar. There's an even more recent example. In 2021, Sri Lanka's government announced a transition to organic, sustainable farming practices. The official narrative was about environmental consciousness. The reality was that the government couldn't afford to import fertilizer anymore. That decision led directly to a famine so severe that Sri Lanka, a country that had been completely self-sufficient in rice production for years, had to spend $450 million importing rice just to prevent mass starvation. And if you remember the news coverage from that period, the people of Sri Lanka stormed the Capitol building and forced the president to flee the country. We have clear historical parallels showing exactly what happens to nations when fertilizer access disappears. So the obvious question becomes, can't we just source potash from somewhere else? Can't we diversify our supply chain so we're not so dependent on Canada that we can't punish them when they don't comply with our demands? No. That's exactly what I'm telling you. We can't. The only alternative sources of potash at the scale we need would be Belarus or Russia, which means American agriculture would be completely controlled by Moscow and Minsk. Do you seriously think this administration would tolerate the food supply of the United States being dependent on Russia? It's an impossible scenario. And yet the threat of 100% tariffs keeps getting thrown around casually. Why? Because initially, China negotiating a new trade deal with Canada wasn't what triggered this response from the president. The real trigger was Mark Carney's speech in Davos. It wasn't just that he challenged America's position as global hegemon. It was that the challenge was met with not just polite applause, but genuine celebration. The global elite in that room were celebrating the idea that the age of American empire is ending. Political chess exists to bring you the analysis that cuts through noise and distraction. Every video here represents hours of research and a critical perspective that goes beyond surface headlines. If this kind of depth matters to you, drop a comment below telling me which aspect of this crisis you want explored further in the next video. The writing is on the wall if you're willing to actually look at it. Countries around the world are dumping US dollar reserves at accelerating rates. Central banks globally now hold more gold than US dollars for the first time in decades. They're rolling over into physical assets. Countries across Europe are physically repatriating their gold reserves from American vaults because the United States is increasingly seen as too high risk, too volatile. An administration that changes its position constantly, that threatens enemies and allies with equal aggression, because to this administration, everyone is potentially an enemy. Even American citizens are starting to feel like enemies as we watch what's unfolding in the streets of Minnesota. This represents a fundamental flaw in strategic planning. The United States maintains a strategic petroleum reserve for fuel. We learned that lesson. But for potash, nothing. Of all the potash imported into the United States, between 85% and 95% gets used every single year. We have no strategic stockpile. There have been funds earmarked to potentially build that strategic reserve or to open domestic potash mining operations, but those facilities won't be operational until 2028 at the earliest. America literally cannot implement a 100% tariff on Canada, regardless of whether it wants to politically, regardless of whether it plays well domestically. The infrastructure to survive that decision simply doesn't exist. And here's something that gets lost in all the political rhetoric. Canada has historically been America's ally. our closest ally. Americans genuinely love Canada. Canadians have traditionally loved Americans. But they're starting to hate our country now, and you can trace that directly to a president who keeps saying unhinged things like Canada should be the 51st state, referring to the Prime Minister as a governor, throwing around petty insults. This is a man who has clearly never suffered real consequences for running his mouth. Donald Trump is someone who's never been punched in the face. That's the simplest way to understand his behavior. Only someone who's never experienced physical consequences for their words talks the way he does. But America is not as secure as we think we are. We're definitely not as secure as this administration keeps claiming. If your definition of security involves hoping that a manufacturing plant in Michigan becomes operational in 2 years, or that we'll have a functioning pipeline from Belarus or Russia by then, you need to stand in front of the American people and explain exactly how secure that makes us and what your reasoning actually is. And while part of me would enjoy seeing the automotive monopoly in America take a serious hit, seeing people able to afford vehicles again, the impact that kind of disruption would have on the working class in both America and Canada makes me hesitate to celebrate. This would devastate local economies across both nations. As always, financial decisions and trade policies made in our respective capitals disproportionately impact the working class the most. People are already living on razor-thin margins. Canada's economy is struggling. America's economy is struggling. People all over the world are finding it increasingly expensive just to exist. There's a housing shortage everywhere. Grocery prices keep climbing. Americans are dealing with levels of corporate greed and opportunistic price gouging that we haven't seen since the end of World War II. What are ordinary people supposed to do in this environment? You prepare as much as you can. You protect yourself where possible. But the reality for Canada, even if you don't particularly like America right now, is that your economy is tied to the United States whether you want it to be or not. 25% of Canadian GDP comes from trade with America. You can't just walk away from that overnight. And it's not simple trade we're talking about. Most of the fresh produce that Canadians consume comes from the United States. Yes, Canada produces enough food to theoretically feed its population twice over, but it's not that simple. The supply chains are integrated. The seasonal dependencies are real. And because Canada essentially holds an agricultural kill switch over America through potash control, any scenario where America's food security was genuinely threatened at that level would inevitably lead to escalation toward military action. Americans might believe we're the strongest nation on the planet, but that belief usually comes from not understanding our own vulnerabilities. We're a wealthy nation, but we don't know where our food actually comes from. We don't understand the supply chain dependencies. Canada controls critical keys to that supply chain, and a 100% tariff would cause prices for essentially every commodity and product in American stores to double even if we somehow secured alternative potash sources. Think about what that means for people who already can't afford food, and that's a rapidly growing number of Americans. The situation would become drastically worse. We always have to come back to the hard numbers. 60% of the American population doesn't have $1,000 in savings for an emergency. They live paycheck to paycheck. So what happens when food prices increase by 40% to 50% across the board? Credit cards only extend so far, and there's disruption happening in the credit card industry right now with executive orders challenging interest rate structures. Something probably should be done about predatory interest rates, but having all these massive changes happening simultaneously creates chaos and uncertainty in markets. Uncertainty in any market is dangerous. Hopefully this scenario doesn't happen. Hopefully cooler heads prevail, because if these tariffs take effect, we're looking at the collapse of both economies. Not the abstract Wall Street economy that rich people care about, the real economy. Working class and middle class people would be squeezed and starved, and I mean that literally. You should be preparing now regardless. Everyone should. If you're holding US dollars, seriously consider diversifying. There are simple ways to do this. Services exist that let you convert USD to other currencies easily. Some people are choosing euros, some are choosing Swiss francs, some are actually looking at Canadian dollars depending on how much European and Chinese investment flows into Canada over the next year. That currency could outperform USD significantly. You need to prepare because you need to ask yourself what your personal breaking point is. Most people right now feel like they don't have a way out of this system, and for the majority, they genuinely don't have easy exit options. But there are always possibilities if you're willing to look. The cost of leaving the country entirely can be done for between $2,500 and $4,500 if you're smart and proactive about it. If you've made it this far in the video, it's because this analysis resonates with you on some level. Political Chess will keep delivering this depth on every topic we cover. Subscribing is the simplest way to ensure these videos keep reaching you. This isn't about chasing subscriber counts. It's about building a community that thinks critically and sees past the manufactured narratives. Now there is a fight worth having, and I understand the pull to stay and resist. I feel that pull. I haven't left. I make these videos. But my ultimate responsibility is to my family and to my people. And my people are the working class of America and the working class globally, because we're all subject to the whims of a wealthy elite whose decisions impact all of us without our input. But let's talk about what's really happening here beneath the surface. This isn't just about tariffs and trade disputes. This is about China winning a geopolitical chess match that most Americans don't even realize is being played. For decades, American foreign policy operated on the assumption that economic integration would make other countries dependent on us, would give us leverage, would ensure compliance. That worked when America was the only massive consumer market that mattered. But China has spent the last 20 years building alternative infrastructure. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't just about roads and ports. It was about creating economic dependency flowing toward Beijing instead of Washington. And Canada, watching America become increasingly unreliable, increasingly aggressive toward allies, increasingly willing to weaponize trade relationships, is making a rational calculation. If your largest trading partner is also increasingly unstable and willing to destroy your economy over political disputes, you diversify. You find other partners. You reduce your vulnerability. That's exactly what Canada is doing. The Pacific Gateway initiative that Canada announced isn't just about building LNG terminals on the West Coast. It's about fundamentally reorienting Canadian trade away from dependence on the United States and toward Asia, toward China, Japan, and South Korea. They're fast-tracking critical mineral exports. They're slashing regulations to accelerate infrastructure development. The Royal Bank of Canada published a report calling this the dependency trap exit strategy. Canada is publicly acknowledging that being 70% dependent on the United States for trade represents a national security vulnerability. They're willing to endure short-term economic pain to break that dependency permanently. And China is there, ready to fill that gap. Chinese state enterprises are signing long-term contracts for Canadian resources. They're investing in Canadian infrastructure. They're building relationships that will last decades. This is the nightmare scenario for American strategists who are actually paying attention. We rely on Canada for NORAD operations. The radar installations that detect Russian missiles coming over the Arctic are on Canadian soil. We rely on Canadian aluminum to build F-35 fighter jets. Canada supplies 70% of US aluminum imports. We rely on Canadian steel for armoured vehicles. If Canada decides to adopt a position of strategic neutrality, if they announce they'll trade equally with all nations without special preference for the United States, suddenly the American defense industrial base has critical vulnerabilities that cannot be easily fixed. We can't build advanced military hardware without their materials. We can't operate our early warning systems without access to their territory. And we're pushing them directly into China's orbit through our own aggressive, short-sighted policies. This is the content that doesn't appear in algorithmic feeds by accident. It surfaces because people like you watch completely, engage in comments, and share it with others who think critically. Every time you send this video to someone, you're spreading a different way of understanding what's actually happening in the world. The United States built a global empire on certain assumptions. That geography had been conquered by technology and military power. That borders were functionally obsolete in the age of global supply chains. That America would always be the indispensable nation that everyone needed access to. We're learning in real time that all of those assumptions were wrong. Geography still matters, resources still matter, and the country that controls physical resources has leverage that financial markets cannot easily replicate or replace. China understood this 20 years ago. They've been systematically securing access to resources all over the planet, while America was distracted by Middle Eastern conflicts and domestic political theatre. They bought mines in Africa. They invested in South American infrastructure. They built ports across Asia. And now they're offering Canada an alternative to complete dependence on an increasingly erratic United States. From Canada's perspective, this isn't about ideology or choosing sides in a new Cold War. It's about survival. It's about national security. It's about ensuring that one volatile administration in Washington can't hold their entire economy hostage. The 100% tariff threat isn't just economically devastating, it's strategically idiotic. It's pushing our closest ally, a country that shares the longest undefended border in the world with us, a country that has fought alongside us in every major conflict for over a century, directly into the arms of our primary geopolitical rival. And for what? Political theatre? Tough guy posturing? The perception of strength for domestic audiences who don't understand the actual stakes. This is how empires fall, not through military defeat, through strategic incompetence, through arrogance that blinds you to your own vulnerabilities, through alienating allies while strengthening adversaries. The Roman Empire didn't fall because barbarians were stronger. It fell because Roman leadership became so disconnected from reality, so focused on internal power struggles, that they stopped noticing the barbarians were inside the gates until it was too late. Parte 7. Political chess is about exactly this kind of analysis, going beyond surface narratives, questioning obvious assumptions, and showing you how power actually operates in the real world. This isn't entertainment. This is understanding the mechanisms that will determine your future whether you pay attention or not. The trade war with Canada will eventually resolve somehow. Phone calls will be made. Deals will be negotiated. Some compromise will emerge. But the fundamental relationship has already changed permanently. Canada has been shown clearly that dependence on the United States is a vulnerability, not a strength. They will diversify. They will build pipelines to the Pacific. They will sign long-term contracts with Asian buyers. They will reduce their exposure to American market volatility. And the United States will have lost something that took over a century to build and can never be fully recovered. Trust. The assumption that we could push them around because we're bigger, wealthier, and more powerful has been shattered. They pushed back. And it worked. Every other country watching this crisis is taking detailed notes. If Canada can successfully call America's bluff, if they can reorient their economy away from US dependence, who else might try? What does that mean for American influence globally? What does it mean for the dollar's status as reserve currency? What does it mean for our ability to project power? These are the questions that matter far more than the immediate headlines about tariff percentages and trade disputes. The long-term strategic implications are what will define the next several decades. As this situation develops over coming weeks and months, pay attention not just to the negotiations and compromises. Pay attention to the infrastructure investments Canada announces. Pay attention to which countries they sign new long-term trade agreements with. Pay attention to the strategic shifts happening while everyone else is distracted by the immediate crisis drama. That's where the real story exists. The global order is shifting beneath our feet while most people scroll through social media completely unaware. The tariff crisis of 2026 might end with some face-saving compromise. But the assumptions that made American dominance possible for 70 years are dead. We're all living in whatever comes next, and most people won't fully understand what happened until it's already finished. China is winning this round not through military confrontation or direct economic warfare. They're winning by being the stable, reliable alternative when America repeatedly demonstrates instability and unreliability. They're winning by offering partnerships instead of demands. They're winning by playing the long game while America focuses on the next election cycle. They're winning by understanding that in the 21st century, the country that controls resources and supply chains matters more than the country with the biggest military budget. And Canada, watching all of this unfold, is making the rational choice to reduce their vulnerability to American chaos. Can you really blame them? The American empire isn't ending because of external enemies. It's ending because of internal dysfunction, strategic incompetence, and arrogance that mistakes temporary dominance for permanent invincibility. History will record this moment, this crisis, as one of the turning points. Not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed. It revealed that American power has limits. It revealed that American threats can be countered. It revealed that American arrogance has costs that will be paid for generations. And it revealed that China has been preparing for exactly this moment, while America wasn't paying attention. The question now isn't whether the American century is ending. The question is what comes after, and whether we'll be prepared for that reality, or still pretending it isn't happening.